Welcome back to The Shepherd's Heart. You don't know this, but we just had lunch and I'm sleepy. So we're going to take a nap this episode. Hey, Humberto, what did you have for lunch?
I had the same thing you had.
No, you had some fruit in yours. I didn't
just
have any fruit
slightly
in mine.
different, but basically it's the same thing.
But they don't know.
Oh, well, it was a salad. It was a very good salad with some chicken on it.
We're proud of you. You ate well. And Mottel, when you put in your lunch order, you said you don't care as long as it's not spicy.
That's right. I'm from the Northeast. I'm bland. I feel very out of place here in West Texas. But I'm sure that you'll force some culture into me by the time I leave.
You are anything but bland.
Okay.
But what can we do? How can we sneak some Mexican food into his diet without him knowing it?
We'll figure it out. There's something we can
dessert
do.
Fajitas.
Fajitas. Okay,
Fajitas.
there you go.
Yeah, they're very tasty, but it's green peppers that give it its spice, not hot sauce.
And it will be an easy transition now to go from that cultural subject to the cultural subject at hand for our time.
Ooh, nice
There you
segue.
go.
Thank you. So what are we talking about this afternoon, this morning, this evening? What are we?
Theologians would call it the contextualization of the gospel.
Well, you raised a specific issue. You said there are some congregations that are starting to use Islamic motifs in their churches to help them reach Muslims.
Yes.
But I was thinking, I don't even know what an Islamic motif is.
Okay. Obviously, in countries where Islam predominates, there are certain art styles, architecture, design elements, all of which bespeak of many Middle Eastern countries. And even people who are not Muslims in those countries dress that way. It's a certain way of dressing, a certain way of decorating the house, and all of these sorts of things. And I brought this subject up because I happen to have some friends who are doing ministry in New York City. And they're in areas that are heavily Muslim. And when they have home fellowships, they are bringing into those fellowships certainly the food items that would be familiar to friends from the Middle East. And even they've started to decorate at least the room where they meet in that sort of Middle Eastern, and really it's an Islamic motif. There are certain design elements because in Islam you are not allowed to draw certain types of animals and other figures, and so they will compensate for that by being very flowery. There's a lot of depictions of flowers and vegetation. And so a number of congregations, and admittedly there are not very many of them, but many of them have started to use these Islamic design motifs.
Well, here's my question, my argument, based in ignorance, because I don't know. But if you're in the Middle East, couldn't you just say it's Middle Eastern as opposed to Islamic?
Yeah, and that's a fair question because obviously we regard Islam as a religion that has not grasped the truth of who Jesus is as Messiah. So it certainly is appropriate to call it Middle Eastern, but if you want to be thoroughly accurate, there are cultures in Indonesia. Indonesia is a majority Muslim country, excuse me, where they would use many of those same styles.
Well, I wonder, though, again, if it's because of the influence of the culture. I don't know. But it seems to me like if you look at a Westerner and you see jeans.
Sure.
Well, everybody says America is a Christian culture, therefore jeans are Christian. You see the...
Right.
And I bring this up because of ignorance I had some years ago, and it was an Egyptian friend that educated me.
Sure.
He's an Egyptian Christian. And you know that head covering that we often see Middle Eastern men wearing?
Sure.
I thought that was a Muslim thing. But he said, that's not a Muslim thing. That's just, Egyptians wear these things, or Middle Easterners wear these things. It's got nothing to do with religion. I didn't know. I thought I'd only seen it on Muslims, so I thought it was Muslim.
Right.
So I just wonder if some of these architectural styles, these motifs.
Well, we can try to say that they're Middle Eastern, but if you're going to be blatantly honest, they're almost exclusively found on mosques, and many of them have their origin in the fact that there is a prohibition about showing human figures. And so they often will compensate by having a great emphasis on floral designs and certain types of floral designs. But it brings up the larger question for all of us: how far are we going to adapt a church service to fit the culture of the folks in our area who may not be believers? Because it's not just this hot button issue of Islamic things. There are cowboy churches.
Right, yeah. We've got them in Tucson.
There are motorcycle churches. There are trucker churches. There's all these sorts of things, and it really raises a question for us of, are we hijacking the gospel? Are we making the gospel subservient and making that culture the main thing? These are real questions, because while it's probably not an issue for most evangelical churches, it's the principle really brings up this sticky question of how malleable is the gospel.
When I was young in the faith, I went to this conference, and the guy was talking about music. And he was talking about, is there a Christian or a non-Christian type of music? And he said, the gospel is the steak, and the music is the sauce on the steak. He said, as long as the steak stays the same, it doesn't matter whether you use A1 or ketchup or whatever you want to use on it. He said, as long as the lyrics are wholesome, the style, the beat, whether you have drums or no drums, tambourine, electric guitar, he says it totally doesn't matter. To me, I think it's a similar concept. As long as we're not diluting the message of the gospel, teaching the Bible for what it says, I'd be okay with a motorcycle church. I'd be okay with a cowboy church. As long as nothing is, whatever isn't forbidden is permitted. That's I guess, my take. Humberto, you feel
It's
different?
important to understand, I guess, the issues. For example, Mario Sandoval, which is a friend of you and I that we've known.
And he was our guest last season of Shepherd's
Yes,
Heart.
he accompanied us. He invited one of the men that I have to come minister at his fellowship for men. And this gentleman that I have in my church comes from a background of heroin use, cocaine abuse. He was involved in gangs in Juarez. I mean, he lived the whole life. He spent many years in prison. Very, very strong life without Christ, and then conversion. And the reason that he invited him, he told me, was that he liked the transformation that Christ had brought to his life. He said, I've known people that come out of that kind of lifestyle, kind of a thug life, but they continue to have the same custom, the same way, the same form. And he was thinking that Raul was a good representation about what the change that Christ wants to bring to the life of an individual. So I hope he was referencing to the fact that through the grace of Christ and the knowledge that he had received, he was treating his wife differently. Mm-hmm. He was dealing with his children in a different way than before. And I think that's probably, it wasn't so much the outward thing, I think, even though I think that...
But he still wore his bandana like this?
No, he doesn't have that, but he's got tattoos all over his hands. He can't, well, he can't take them up, but he doesn't.
Right.
So I think that's kind of the same kind of deal, how he came out of that, and so I think he noticed a change, and he's hoping that other people that were coming from that would also see that there needs to be a certain change. Not so much maybe outwardly, but yes, maybe in that lifestyle you don't honor your wife in a certain way, and
Sure.
now you should honor your wife. Maybe you speak down to her in that lifestyle, and that's fine, but not in this lifestyle.
Sounds like steak and salsa.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hey, Mottel, when I was in Chicago at the Moody Bible Institute, there was a guy there. He was a previous pimp. Mm-hmm. So he had the real garish clothing with the bright colors, jewels all over his hands, chains all over his necks, a hat,
Wow.
the stereotypical pimp.
It came out of Central Casting.
Stereotypical, right there.
Right there.
He was a follower of the Lord, and he ministered to prostitutes and pimps.
Wow.
And he didn't change the way he dressed. I don't know if he didn't change because that's how he dressed, mm-hmm. or if he made a conscious decision, I'm going to maintain this appearance so I can minister to the people from my... I don't know which it was.
Obviously, the core verse that really impacts us, and we've discussed this in slightly other contexts, but the core Bible verse, we're driven back to it once again, really is the central issue in this question, and it's that 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20 verse, because not only does it impact how we do evangelism, but it impacts how we do our congregations. So reading it, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20, says there, to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. And the word Jew there is not simply a plain word, it's literally Judean. Paul is speaking, and Paul was a Jew from the diaspora. He was a Jew from Tarsus. His culture and his style wasn't Judean. In essence, even though he was Jewish, he had to adopt the Judean style in order to effectively reach Judeans. So to the Judeans I became as a Judean, that I might win the Judeans. To those who are under the law, I became as under the law, though not being myself under the law. You can't be more clear about that. That I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, I became as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Messiah, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I've become all things to all men, that I may by all means win some. So Paul was willing to set aside his personal preferences for the sake of gospel effectiveness. Now that's certainly one issue that stands by itself. But the issue that you have opened up here is once a person is a believer, how, is there a need, do we have to put some of those things behind us? The example that Humberto just gave about the transformation in this young person from being a gang guy involved in drugs, it was very clear the difference that Messiah had made in his life. And yet, if he had come into the barrio with a very clean-cut appearance.
By the way, I'm impressed that you know the word barrio. Very impressed.
That's one of about 4 words that I know. I'm getting an education. So if he had come into a situation like that, looking like, like a gringo, like a guy who was not from the neighborhood, and he was trying to impact young men in that community, they might have said, no, you're not really from here. You don't belong here. We don't trust you. You might be a narco. You might be this. You might be that. So, we like things to be either black or white, but sometimes there's kind of a blend and a transition. I can well understand the wonderful testimony that this fellow was able to give, but on the other hand, he may no longer be the best person to reach hardcore, unrepentant gang members. It may be someone else. That's a messy answer, and people don't like this gray area. People like all the things sewn up and presented on a platter.
I have a question. How about the issue like of Jesus Christ when he comes to Nazareth and he's not received? The Bible says that a prophet is never received in his own country. What is the reason that a prophet was not received in his own country? In his case, they were saying his mother's Mary.
Yeah, they know him
his
too
father's
well.
Joseph. All of his brothers and sisters are here with us. So apparently it worked negatively
Yes.
in that case also. It worked negatively that they would have preferred for it to be, somebody coming from Asia or the Philippines,
outside, yeah.
thus saith the Lord. They would be more impressed than somebody that, I see him every day. It's that same old guy.
This 1 Corinthians passage, to the Jew or the Judeans, I became a Jew. To the weak, I became weak. To those without the law is without the law, though not without the law. Right. Reminds me of what we deal with on a regular basis in the Messianic community.
Sure.
I've got a friend who lives in a very Jewish neighborhood, and his Jewish lifestyle is much more obvious than mine, in part because that's the culture.
Right. Okay.
When I hang out with a bunch of religious people, I change the way I live to be more, not accepted, because I'm already accepted, but to I don't even know what words to use.
Make them comfortable. Make them at ease.
There we go.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is, I guess it's the same idea, I like how it started off, though. The verse right before said, what verse was that, 17?
That would be 19.
So then,
Though I am free from all men, I've made myself slave to all that I might win the more.
I'm free, but I've made myself a slave for the benefit of others, so that I might win others. And I suppose we do that all the time. If you move into, you move from New York to Oklahoma, and everybody in Oklahoma wears cowboy hats and boots. Chances are, next time you hit the store, you're going to be buying a pair of cowboy boots and a hat. You may not move on a farm,
Right.
but you're the only guy with a pair of Nikes and the Dockers. And even though they accept you exactly how you are, there's no peer pressure, nobody's mocking you. When in Rome, you kind of want to look like everybody else and talk like everybody else.
Sure.
And
So again, these are things that we can do. I think we can use our own mind, use our own imagination and imagine this. But then there's also issues like Jesus Christ. He says in that case to the Jewish people, he says, John came and his presentation was like this. I mean, he was just like Elijah. I mean, camel hair, he was eating locusts. He was like a wild man. He was out there very strong, And I come, and I sit down and I eat, I drink wine or whatever. I do these things, and they don't receive him because he said, he's crazy. He's got a demon. And this guy, well, he's a friend of sinners. And so he says, you can't please one way, you can't please the other way. In effect, what he's saying, those that are called or those that are really hungry, it doesn't matter if you come like John or you come like Jesus, eventually they're hungry, they're thirsty, and God draws them to them. So again, a lot of the issues.
I was, coincidentally, from our perspective, because there's no coincidences with a sovereign God, this very Sunday, somebody came up to me and asked my perspective on this topic, but in a different way.
Okay.
He said, Steve, I want your opinion. There's this recovery group, people getting over drugs and all sorts of addictions.
Sure.
And when they express themselves, they're using extremely foul language. And he says, I understand that. I'm not being critical of it. But the people leading the group, the mature men of God, are using the same language. And they say it's okay because we're helping them in their recovery. What do you think? I said, I do not think it's okay. I said, like you, if somebody is recovering and they're confessing their sin and they're sharing their grief and their hurt and they're using bad language, I'm not going to say a thing. I'm not going to correct them. That's not the time or the place.
Yeah.
But a man of God leading the meeting, he should know better.
Exactly.
There's no call to it. And I quoted a passage of Scripture, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, only that which is good, that edifies the hearers, that which imparts grace. So he said, I'm sorry, I don't agree with it. So there are extremes. There's places where we cross over the line in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and that would be one of those in my opinion.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly concur. I mean, the transformation that Messiah makes is, one of the things is to clear out all ungodliness and evil speak and gesture.
Yeah.
And his continued use of that sort of language is really a sad thing. I don't think it really impresses the folks there. I think part of what Humberto shared previously, what was so impressive about this fellow giving the testimony was the transformed life. The transformed life. Engaging in culture is a different matter than wallowing in sin.
Yeah.
Using these sorts of profanities, the profanities of the drug world, that's just engaging in sin. That's not a legitimate human culture. Yeah. I understand he's doing everything he can, but he might be surprised at how just an expression of love and acceptance by him and the church to these folks who have been pushed away from society, that will be just so revolutionary for them to see. They're not expecting to be accepted as they are. And so I think that is a misapplication of the principle.
Yeah, I think so too. For me personally, when I came to faith, I had a foul mouth right before I came to faith. And one of the first things that changed in my life that was obvious was my language cleaned up. I didn't have to be a 5-year saint who was well-versed in Scripture to know that wasn't right. No. It was crass talk and it was inappropriate, and I gave it up.
Yep.
So there are some things that, we change, some things we don't change. Humberto, it looked like you wanted to say
Well,
something.
just again, we are called to help people in a conversion. They are to be converted to Christ. They're not to be converted to my denomination or to my church or to my Hispanic culture. They're to be converted to Christ. So we always have to have in mind that we are called to see a conversion in the life of people. And so while we cannot force conversion, or we cannot force conversion, but there is an expectation of a conversion, because if there's no conversion, then what are we calling them to? Obviously, it's a new life. It's a transformed life. And so that is our charge and our responsibility. There's a scripture in the Bible where God tells Jeremiah that they needed to convert unto him, and he did not need to convert unto them. And so that's the only thing I'm afraid of in all of these things, that we lose sight of that kind of teaching that comes out of the Bible too. That yes, we want to convert them to us. And again, it says to us, it means that we should be walking like Christ. We should be walking in love. We should walk like Christ. So in essence, we're not converting them to us, but to Christ. But if we're not careful, then what is happening in this desire to reach out to people, instead of them converting to us, then we are converting to them. And then what are we calling them to?
Yeah.
I think one thing that's very important to recognize, and it needs to be held as a value, is that God is no respecter of persons. In essence, by extension, he's no respecter of cultures.
Yes.
It's a hard lesson to accept for many American evangelicals, but American evangelical church culture is not the native culture of the first century.
So tell me if you would agree. If Yeshua showed up in your typical American mall today, he'd probably be wearing jeans, T-shirt, and sneakers. If he showed up into, I don't know, where else do they wear a different kind of clothes? Maybe a robe in Africa. If he showed up in Africa, I don't think he'd be wearing the clothes that they wear in Europe. Do you disagree with me?
Yeah, well, it's such a theoretical question. I think that the real issue for us is this, that just as the 1 Corinthians 9 passage said that we're free in these cultural issues, just as the entire chapter of Romans 14 gives us cultural freedom, the thing that people really do need to embrace and internalize is that their preferred church culture is not the culture of the first century. It very rarely even exists almost anywhere in the world. There are certain areas in the Middle East where you can catch glimpses of it, but it really gets us off our high horse and says we have no right to speak down to anyone. And it's a hard thing, especially as a new Jewish believer, joining an evangelical church in the late 70s, early 80s. I got a lot of you'll come to understand when you embrace this or when you embrace that. Basically, they wanted me to embrace conservative evangelical Protestant church culture. When you dare to suggest that there wasn't a conservative evangelical Protestant church culture even 300 years ago.
Right.
Does that mean that true worship didn't exist 300 years ago? Long before white Americans in suburbia were worshiping Jesus, there were people in Africa who were worshiping the Lord in African culture. And before them, there were Jews in the Middle East, in the land of Judea, who were worshiping the arrived Messiah in Jewish culture. So the only original culture was a Jewish culture. And yet Romans 14 tells us even that is not what makes the gospel. It's the first culture that the gospel appeared in. But this issue of how far do we contextualize a church, before you go making those decisions, you need to first come to the realization that there is no one Christian culture. And that's a real, there are some churches that I've previously spoken in that may not invite me back if they view this program.
Well,
Wait a minute. Is he trying to tell me that Jesus wasn't American and a Republican? Is that what he's trying to say?
it wasn't American or Republican.
I have news for Humberto. He was not.
I put up a picture of C.S. Lewis. I think he had a stein of beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other.
Yeah.
as part of a sermon
Yes.
illustration a while
Yeah.
back to kind of make a similar point. Said in our culture in America today, smoking is equated with sinning and drinking is equated with sinning. And I said that is purely cultural. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the Bible or godliness. And that was what I used to
And
make my point.
we can still say that smoking cigarettes is probably not a good idea, but it's not the type of sin of character that some of the named sins in the Bible are. I think it's a foolish pursuit. It certainly would really call into question for a person aspiring to the office of an elder. It would really call into question his whole priorities in life, were he to spend time and money involved in that sort of thing. But no, there is this basic issue that there is no one automatic Christian culture. And so we do have freedom, as Romans 14 says, in some of these things about how we decorate the church, what style, and even what instruments are in the church.
Right.
It truly is an element of freedom, as Romans 14 says.
I think this whole topic came back to the surface because we know Paul dealt with it. He addressed it in 1 Corinthians. But with Hudson Taylor, the China Inland Mission.
Oh, my God. Thank you for bringing that up.
He was a European, Brit,
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
Moved to China, put on the long dark robe,
Chinese robe.
did his hair and hat the way the Chinese people did, and it was scandalous.
Yes. The other missionaries were convinced he had gone crazy.
Yeah.
And they were condemning him
Yes.
and writing letters back to Europe saying, call this guy back.
Yep. And now he's become an example to us all.
He was effective. They were ineffective.
Yeah. Exactly.
Excellent example.
Hudson Taylor, China Inland Mission.
As a result of his work, now there's millions of Chinese, one of
Yes.
the greatest churches, as a direct result of
Yes, and people have followed his example ever since.
Yes.
We don't go to foreign cultures and try to force our ways on them.
Yeah.
We let them do things their way. Just to wrap up, we've only got a few seconds left. We went and helped plant a church in Nogales, Mexico. And as soon as it was on its feet, we just got out of the way. It had nothing to do with us. We were just helping. And they said, thank you. That's not usually what foreigners do. We said, it was our pleasure. Well, this is The Shepherd's Heart. We're going to take a little break, and we will see you on the other side. God bless.
GLC invites you to visit us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/GLCTV. Here you can stay in touch with all of the latest GLC news, along with daily scriptural inspirations, current specials in our bookstore, links to our newest shows, and online media, plus articles from trusted sources. Feel free to drop us a message or a question by posting to our page. Please help us out and like our page by clicking on the thumbs up button. Don't delay. Drop by the GLC Facebook page at facebook.com/GLCTV. We want to interact with you today.
Welcome back to The Shepherd's Heart. As we always do, we were talking off camera. This topic, it might generate some sparks. None of us are fighters, but I think we might have different perspectives. And rather than shy away from it, we just decided to plow right into it. We're talking about pastors here. He is a pastor. I am a pastor. He was a pastor. Functions as a pastor in the sense of calling, but I'm talking about having the position in a congregation as a pastor. And we use the word pastor. You could use rabbi in the Messianic context. That's fine too. Over 1,300 pastors were terminated by the local church each month, many without cause, according to some statistics Pastor Humberto came across. Why do you suppose pastors are getting fired? And is it kosher to fire a pastor? Mottel, you're the one who thought you'd be contrary, so let's give you the floor.
This is a subject that oftentimes people will take the Word of God and set it aside if it doesn't fit their experience. There are very few subjects where people are so willing to set aside the Word of God to accomplish something out of expediency, something that will fit the current need. I believe there's a basic principle, and that principle is laid out in the Scripture, that when New Testament congregations were addressed, there was the expectation that there would be elders who would be in leadership of the congregation. Now, certainly among any group of elders, there may be one person by virtue of his other responsibilities in life, who is more able to take the leader among the leaders. He is the most equal among equals. And so my understanding of the New Testament scriptures, and we studied this extensively as I prepared to take our congregation forward, is what is the New Testament model of leadership? And I think you have to come away from that saying the model is a plurality of elders, that in each locality, when the apostles came to a new locality, they expected to find elders functioning in any established church. And it's always in the plural. It's never that there was a single elder. When the elders of the local church were addressed, it was always the plural elders. Of course, this is different from a new church plant, but whenever there was an established church, there was the expectation that elders would be those in charge, and that does not preempt or make the idea of one person being uniquely responsible off the table.
Well, let's see. We know there's different church government systems out there.
Yes, without a doubt.
There's deacon-led congregations, there's congregational-led congregations, there's single pastor-led congregations,
Yes.
and there's elder congregations. Mottel's statement that the biblical model is a plurality of elders, I agree with. We're not in contradiction there. What's your perspective, Humberto?
My perspective on this is that there is always a need for an abundance of counsel as we make decisions and things. I tend more to look that there will always be a defined leader. I believe that in the midst of these elders, as we call them, I think there would be an individual that would be a defined leader. I believe he would gain that place or that trust. And maybe he didn't have to have a title or anything, but eventually when we're leading, eventually, to me, there is a head that leads or gives direction to something.
I have found that happens even in congregations that say it's not supposed to happen. You have a group of elders that are all supposed to be equal and the same. Nobody's supposed to be in charge. That's their doctrine.
Yeah.
But there's always a stronger leader who rises up and de facto takes the leadership.
And to me, that's a manifestation sometimes of a need that is there present. And so I believe very much in the need for the pastor to be very humble. And again, a pastor should be a servant to all. Should be a servant of all. So we need counsel, we need advice, we need direction. But I believe that there comes a times when decisions are going to have to be made, and when they have to be made, somehow we need to figure out a way to make a decision. And that doesn't mean that through eldership you can't. I believe you can. But I believe, again, in that eldership, there is a people really got to be a much more spiritual, much more all of this.
I agree.
In order to be able to do that, because it's not an easy thing.
I like to give this illustration all the time. I say, okay, let's talk about a ship.
Yeah.
You got one guy says turn left to the iceberg, the other guy says turn right to the iceberg. How long are you going to argue about it?
Exactly.
Eventually, somebody better turn that wheel, you're going to hit the iceberg.
Exactly.
And so even though I do agree with the plurality of elders, I also agree that it's only sensical and the only workable way in almost all situations, one person has to rise to the top.
So let me display some contrarian suggestions then. So they look ahead, they get a radio report, there's an iceberg 20 miles ahead of you, and it's immense. You can't go through it, you've got to go around it. So if you have three elders, the three officers in this case, the three of them assemble on the bridge, they look at the maps, they get through the binoculars, and the decision is not left to one man, but the decision is a joint decision of all three.
Well, you're messing up my metaphor, because the iceberg's not 20 miles away, it's 2 seconds away.
Oh, no,
and
2
somebody's
seconds.
got to make a decision
The
now.
guy with their hand on the wheel has to make the decision. But during the time that the congregation that I was involved in for so many years was at its healthiest, was a time during which the elders would not act unless they were in unity. Let me give you one story, one anecdote that is really was so dramatic. We were, as a congregation, at an impasse during the time that I was senior pastor there, because we were in a time period we were seeking to grow the congregation. During the 4 years that I was there, the Lord did a wonderful thing. We doubled the size of the congregation in 4 years. Amazing thing. And so we're coming up now. I've insisted, no, we need to find a man who's going to be full-time, because while the Lord has given us favor during this time, this is not my skill set. This is not my full calling. And so we attempted to meet and make a decision on how to go forward. And we invited a man who had previously been an elder in another congregation to join and sit in on a joint meeting of what was the fledgling group of elders. We had just jettisoned the steering committee. You had elders, and we also had trustees. So we had elders who met the biblical qualifications in the scriptures for eldership, and we had other men and women who were trustees. And we were going back and forth and back and forth.
I'm sorry, but what's a trustee?
A trustee, in essence, is the biblical office of deacon.
Okay.
But the state of New Jersey says you've got to have, the corporation has to have a trustee. And so we simply said, let's accomplish two things at once. These will be the biblical deacons, and these will be the board of trustees for purposes of state government.
Gotcha.
And so we had this man observing, offering suggestions. He had been in this process many times of how to set up a pastoral search committee. Back and forth. We said, well, let's just take a vote. It's clear we were divided. And he said, please, I know I'm new here, but you've asked me to sit in. He said, if the Spirit of the Lord is here, there's going to be unity. He says, you have no unity. A vote is a vote of who has been the most persuasive.
Yeah.
If God has revealed to the congregation what he wants to do, he's going to reveal that to the leadership. It's clear that he has not. Don't force a vote now. Take a week and pray, and then come back and see if the Lord has given the answer. Yeah. And to the more cerebral among us, we said, no, we can figure this out. We have a good muscle up here in our brain. And others said, that's right. And others said, no, that's what our friend just said is wisdom. God hasn't shown up in this conversation, and it would be foolish for us to force a vote and go forward. Let's pray. That's what we did. For a week we prayed. By the midweek, all of a sudden, an option which we had never considered all of a sudden appeared. Someone made a phone call to us, offered a possibility to us that, this is the solution. Wish we would have known about it back then, but if we would have voted, this would not have been a possibility. The thing that appeared midweek, all of a sudden the Lord showed up.
And the whole group liked that idea.
The whole group's, there it is.
There it is.
There's God's solution. And so from that point forward, we said, we really need to go forward in unity. And the unity, one-mindedness of a group of elders, unless it's something extraordinary, was something that we felt that we needed to have before we would make a decision.
Am I correct in thinking that whatever government the first century believers used was somehow a model that they took out of Judaism?
Yes.
How the synagogues were governed? And is it
yes.
Probably?
The elders. There's a word in Hebrew called zakinim. Okay. The ones who are revered and elderly and respected. Right. The zakinim, you see this in the first century in synagogue structure. Obviously, you're outside the temple. It's synagogue structure. But synagogue structure was basically set up by a guy named Ezra in the Bible. Right. He found himself needing to continue these traditions forward. And so the New Testament gives God's imprimatur to it and says plurality of eldership is the ideal toward which we should go. Now, I fully and wholeheartedly embrace the idea there has to be a leader among the elders. For this reason, many churches...
Well, you used the expression earlier, an equal
most equal among equals.
Most equal amongst equals.
Because basically, this is the fellow, you can have a congregation that's elder-led, but even the brethren folk, brethren congregations, brethren assemblies that are very strong on this elder-led
Which is
thing.
the assembly I had in mind in my
Yes.
reference earlier
Yep.
to the who said it was against their doctrine, but it's still
Right.
yeah.
Plymouth Brethren groups, I'm familiar with them in the Northeast. Most of them currently now have what is called a presiding elder. He doesn't have any more authority than the other elders, but because he is paid and he is full-time vocational in ministry, it is his responsibility to coordinate the activities of the assembly, to make sure that sick ones are being visited in the hospital, set up a schedule. And it's a blessing. I'm on their schedule. I'm one of the few non-brethren outside speakers they'll ever have in.
Wonderful.
So twice a year I go to this assembly. The worship is wonderful, the breaking of bread every Sunday there. But they truly have made this work, and there's an equality among the people, even while they look to this one individual to be the most equal. And ultimately, if he hears from the Lord, they're going to move aside and allow him to exercise leadership.
Because again, as you look at the book of Acts, when they had to make the determinations about circumcision, what was necessary to be converted, Paul spoke, Peter spoke, but the last word was Jacob's word.
Yeah.
And so it lets us know who was the most equal amongst equal.
He hears it all, and he finally stands up. By the way, people may know that Jacob is James.
James
in the English Bible.
Okay. And so it happens again later when Paul comes in and they have the discussion about, well, they're saying that you're teaching them to forsake, the Torah and all this. And it's James that is telling them this. It's James that is good. So again, he is shown to be the most equal amongst equal, as you're saying.
And it works out if we follow Yeshua's instruction that the leader should be servant of all and humble,
That's
as you
right.
pointed out earlier.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this concept of being the most equal amongst equals, which, by the way, is based on the Roman Senate when Caesar rose up.
Okay.
He was the first amongst equals. But as we all know, he wasn't so equal for very
Right.
long.
Yes.
He was just first. And it does happen in congregations where the senior pastor will become more of a tyrant. Even if he's a benevolent dictator, he's still, a little too equal, if you know what I mean. So I'm more on the side of there has to be a leader, but I believe the plurality of elders is the accountability for the congregation.
Right.
And
again, one of the governments that I always look to is, again, what God showed Moses was when he was in the desert. He was all tired. He was saying, take me away. I can't handle it anymore. I can't handle these people anymore. And the Lord said, well, you need to raise up leaders alongside of you. And so this is kind of the way that we've set up the church. We see the church working and functioning in that way, where there are many leaders among the church. There are elders in the church. They are doing a certain work. They try to work out the problems that people have from day to day. And whatever they can, then they bring it to other leaders that are, capable of dealing with it.
The burden placed on this senior leader, the full-time pastor, whether we call him the senior pastor or a co-elder or whatever. Let me read some statistics. I got these from you, and you gave me the source from them over the phone a couple weeks ago, but they're sad. Let me read them to you. 80% of pastors, 80%, and 84% of their spouses feel discouraged and unqualified. 50% of pastors feel so discouraged that they would leave the ministry if they could, but they have no other way of making a living. 70% of pastors feel grossly underpaid, which is a small figure in light of the next statistic. 90% of pastors report working between 55 to 75 hours a week. 70% of pastors constantly fight depression. 70% of pastors do not have a close friend. So whatever we think, whatever we do, we have to be extremely concerned for the well-being of our leaders, their emotional well-being, their families' well-being, because they are under significant pressure.
I would say for the government that we think is the best, I think the proof is in the pudding. So we need to look at these kind of things. if I say this is the best kind of government and this is what's happening to my leaders, then I need to examine.
Something's wrong.
I say, well, is this really the best? Maybe, or whatever, So that's what I would say, Whatever form of government you're going to use, it better be working. It better be effective. It better be bringing results. And if it's not, then we need to consider something else. Maybe it needs to be a small change, maybe something. But again, the proof is in the pudding. So we need to have good, stable congregations with pastors that are confident, they're growing, their family is being taken care of. And if we do that, then we know we're doing something right.
One of the things that is a reality whenever you quote statistics is someone else has a different survey. When I was preparing for some of these issues, found a survey online that was very different than the one that you just quoted. Lifeway.net, I believe it is, did a survey 5-6 years ago that had far more benign sorts of numbers. They were all lower. Why? Because this survey, that you quoted, was probably a general Protestant survey. The Lifeway survey was more just evangelicals. Yeah. And here's what I would take away from that. I think a lot of people who go into liberal Protestant ministry have rather secular sorts of values. Yeah. They're not in ministry for the right reason. To them, it's a career step. They expect to be stepping up in the career. They're looking to teach at the university or something eventually. So their heart motivation may not be in it. It may simply be an academic exercise for them. So certainly we would understand why they would feel discouraged because it hasn't all worked out. Their families may not be supportive at all. In contrast to that would be the issue of a person who is a born-again believer, who is evangelical, who is embraces ministry as a way of life. There is a different approach to it. Amongst those folks, the statistics were not wonderful, but they were all lower than that.
Yeah. I know this is, you're going to have to think off the top of your head, but you've been active in a lot of churches for many years. You've got a lot of churches that support your ministry. You speak at their churches.
Oh, yeah.
And for the most part, they're evangelical.
Yes.
Over the last 25 years, the majority of these churches, do they still have the same senior pastor?
25 years is extremely unusual for a church to have the same pastor. However, in the particular association of churches that I most often speak at, it is not unusual for a man to be there 12 to 15 years.
Okay, so 12 to 15 years is not too unusual.
That is not unusual. And the reason is this particular association of churches values stability. They value call. So when a man is called, there's a high hurdle that is there to make sure that he truly is an individual sold out to the Lord. In contrast, not to get too dangerous here, but here this is a well-known fact. This I'm not speaking out of school. It is the policy of the United Methodist Church that every 3 to 4 years they intentionally move their pastor to another location.
Sure, and I would hope something like that would have nothing to do with these statistics. Because,
hopefully not, because it's a church that is no longer really in many locations, with some exceptions certainly, but in most locations it's not an evangelical Bible preaching church. So if those were factored in, certainly I've spoken to United Methodist pastors who were very unhappy with that system, who were evangelical.
Well, leaving them aside, and this denomination that you said 12 to 15 years is not untypical, what would you say the typical evangelical pastor stays at his church?
They're there, in my experience, typically 11 to 12 years.
And how about your experience?
Again, I don't have the connection that he has with many different types of pastors. In my estimation, I would want to be a pastor where I'm at until the day I die. I mean, that's how I see it.
Oh, that's ideal, yeah.
I'd be afraid to say that because they'd kill me.
They'd run you out of town. But to me, it's that way, because I see it as all being relational. So I'm not going to be my children's father for 12 years, I'm going to be my children's father until I die.
And I don't disagree with that at all. I'm just trying to look at what's going on out there.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of measuring of yourself by looking at other people. My wife and I, when we made the decision for me to leave the secular field, to leave the dental field, and to go into full-time ministry, it was a lifetime commitment. Yeah. We didn't put a limit of years, and we had no idea what the future would hold. And so it just seems to me, because I've been on both sides now. I've served as either pastor, associate pastor, in that context was a Messianic rabbi for almost 17 years. Before that, established a Messianic fellowship. And then I had the unique opportunity for a number of those years to serve as an elder in the same congregation that I had been the senior pastor on. So I've seen it from both sides. And I'll simply say that you really need to see it as a calling. If you're, overly concerned about numbers of hours, it just seems to me that a lot of fellows who think that they're working 60 and 70 hours a week, that's what it feels like to them, because they may not have the right heart attitude. If you actually had a stopwatch and actually clocked their hours, I suspect it might be a different story. If you go into it with the wrong sort of heart attitude, it seems like you're never, done. Now, certainly as a pastor, I always understood that I could be called in the middle of the night. On 2 occasions, I received phone calls at 2 in the morning, and those are never good. Those are always horrendous. Something really bad has happened, and they were. And I get dressed, jump in the car, and try to support a family in the midst of a crisis of some sort. And that is what God called me to do. My wife understood that. It went with the territory. And God had prepared me to do it. He had gifted me to do it. And so I better, because I was his hands.
I agree with what Mottel is saying. I mean, it's all about calling. It all comes down to that. How do you look at things? In one of the statistics that we were reading, it says that ministry was not what they had imagined. Well, when you get into this ministry, I mean, it's not so much what I imagined, it's that I gave myself to the Lord. And so I had no real expectations of something except that the Lord would take care of me, except that the Lord told me and called me to do something, and I know he would be with me. And so really calling is something very important, that we go into it not as a career choice. I already had my career. And I made a choice for not being there because it was not going to be fulfilling, because I was not made for that. So I left the career for a calling. And it's kind of like he's saying, a lot of people go into it as a career. It's not really
I know a guy, he's been in ministry, I'm trying to think how many years full-time. I'll say 20 to 25, somewhere in there. I admire him tremendously. He's one of my favorite people, man of God, one of those kind of people you could turn your back on. You can give him your life savings and your power of attorney, and you know he won't abuse it. That kind of guy, totally trustworthy. Serves the saints to exhaustion, and has done it year after year after year for about 20 years. Maybe it's his age. Maybe it's the accumulation of the stress. He was very successful in ministry, by the way. He worked with an extremely large church. And he got to the point where he's just tired, and he couldn't function well anymore. Burnt out. Though he didn't use the word, I could see it in him.
Okay.
And he's definitely called. Definitely one of those guys who puts in 60 to 75 hours, not fake, for reals.
There are others.
And and was happy to do it. But he got to the point where he no longer could.
Understood.
And I just want to, to say there's that side of the coin too.
Yes.
And he's not complaining. He's not the kind of guy who says I'm underpaid and underappreciated, but he's just the guy that's burnt out. He's worn out. And I happen to think that if he doesn't take care of himself, he'll be done. He'll be done.
We go about human bodies. Every pastor has a human body, human head, human brain, and we are finite. But I think it brings up the issue. There are probably men functioning as pastors who should not be in that role.
Yep.
There are churches that are been struggling for years, that are limping along in a very poor way. It might be better for them to merge with other churches and do it better, be more encouraging, so that you don't feel as though all your efforts is going toward keeping a corpse on life support.
I wish we had more time, because there's so much more that we could do with this issue. But unfortunately, we're wrapping up this episode of The Shepherd's Heart. We've got Pastor Porras. You've been in ministry 25 years as a pastor?
I've been in ministry now full-time 28 27 years.
27 years. And Mottel, about the same, huh?
35 years.
35 years.
But I started when I was just knee-high to the
6?
grass.
Yeah. Wow. And for me, 30 years, 25 full-time as a pastor. So between the three of us, we could go back to the days of Moses. And we're just scratching on the surface.
Yeah.
We've got a lot more topics to talk about. When we come back for our next episode, we're going to talk about impacting our culture for Messiah. What should we do and to what extent? And we've got lots of other topics to handle.
Wonderful.
I hope you'll be joining us this time and next time on The Shepherd's Heart. We'll see you then. God bless. Bye-bye.
This program was produced by and for God's Learning Channel. If you enjoyed this program, we need your support to help keep this program on GLC. Please make your checks out to God's Learning Channel, P.O. Box 61000, Midland, Texas 79711-1000. Please be sure to designate where your contribution is intended. It is very important to let GLC know which programs you enjoy and support.
Order your copy of this program from the GLC bookstore by calling the numbers or visiting the website on your screen. Please include the program number when ordering.